Wealthy Cowboy inherited a trading post. 11 children already lived inside. The deed was rolled up in a leather tube, tied with a piece of cord gone stiff with age, and when I pulled it loose, a little cloud of brown dust came off it and settled on the front of my shirt. That's how I remember first touching the thing. Not with any ceremony. Just a puff of old dust and a leather smell and my name written on a document that meant nothing to me yet. I was standing in a lawyer's office in Tucson. A narrow room, 2 chairs, a window that looked at a wall, and a man named Hargrove who wore his collar 2 sizes too tight was telling me that my uncle Calhoun Pratt had died of a heart failure 4 weeks prior and had left me, being his only living kin, the whole of a trading post and way station out on the Rio Salado flats, along with 14 head of mule, a barn that needed some roof work, and a small account at a bank in Mesa that wouldn't cover a month's feed. I asked Hargrove if there was anything else I ought to know. He looked at his hands. He said, "There are some children." I said, "Some." He said, 11. I want to be honest about what I did next. I laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, the kind that comes up before you can stop it. Because I was 43 years old and I had spent 22 of those years building the Pratt Fork Ranch from a quarter section of scoured hardpan into something that ran 4,000 head on good grass. And I had done it without a wife, and without children, and without asking one single human being for more than a day's honest labor in exchange for a day's honest wage. My life was clean and deliberate, and I knew where everything in it stood. Hargrove did not laugh with me. He put a paper on the desk. It was a letter from a woman named Nora Blaine, written in a small, neat hand, informing him that she had been employed at the trading post as cook and teacher and general keeper of the household since Calhoun Pratt had taken sick the previous winter, and that if the heir intended to sell the property, she would require 30 days' notice to make arrangements for the children, as they had nowhere else to go. I read it twice. Nowhere else to go. That stopped the laughing. I didn't sell. I want to say I made that decision for noble reasons, but the truth is simpler than that. I rode out there on a Thursday, just to see the place before I made any decision at all, and when I came around the last bend in the road, flat yellow land opening out on both sides, the Salado a brown line to the south, mountains blue and far. The trading post sat there low against the earth like it had been there since before the dirt was dry, and it was the most solid-looking thing I'd seen in a long time. 2 stories, adobe, with a deep front portal that ran the length of the building. A corral that needed fence work on the east side. A row of cottonwoods someone had planted years back and watered into real size. And hanging from one of those cottonwoods, a child. Small, maybe 8, sitting in the fork of a branch about 15 feet up, eating something out of a cloth and watching me ride in with the flat, steady expression of a person who has decided nothing you do will surprise them. I pulled up. I said, "That's safe." The child, a boy I saw, with black hair cut straight across the forehead, looked down at the branch under him, appeared to weigh the question genuinely, and said, "Mostly." I tied my horse at the post and went inside. The front room of the trading post was wide and low-ceilinged, with shelves along 3 walls that were still stocked. Dried goods, hardware, bolts of cloth, candles in paper wrappers, rope in coils. A wood stove in the center, 2 long tables. The smell of the place was flour and lanolin and wood smoke, and something underneath all of it, sweet and faint, that I didn't identify until later as the specific smell of a house where children live, something between beeswax and grass and the particular warmth of small sleeping bodies. A woman came through from the back. She was perhaps 35, not tall, wearing a gray dress with the sleeves rolled past her elbows and her dark hair pinned up without much attention paid to the pinning. She carried a cast-iron pan, and she set it on the stove with the authority of someone who knows every inch of a kitchen without having to look. She did not smile. She looked at me the way you look at weather coming in, with attention, without alarm. She said, "Mr. Pratt." I said, "Miss Blaine." She said, "You'll want to see the books." I said I would. She went and got them. That was Nora. That was the whole first meeting, and it contained more information than it looked like. She didn't fuss at me, didn't ask what I intended, didn't plead or bargain or make herself small and grateful. She brought the books and set them in front of me and stood back, and what the books said was that Calhoun had run a thinner operation than you'd expect, that the post was profitable enough in summer when the freighters and settlers came through but lean in winter, and that for the past 8 months The money coming in had been just enough to feed 11 children, and not a nickel more for anything else. I asked her about the children. She sat down across from me only when I gestured to the chair. Before that she stood and she told me. 4 of them were Calhounds by blood, though he'd never been married. 3 boys and a girl ranging from 7 to 14. 3 were left by travelers who couldn't or wouldn't keep them. A set of twin girls the age of 6, and a boy of 10 who'd come with a family headed to California and been quietly forgotten when the family's wagon moved on. 2 were Apache, a brother and sister, whose parents had died of a fever the prior spring and who had simply stayed because no one told them to leave and Calhoun hadn't the heart to. 1 was a Mexican girl named Florida, age 9, who'd been brought by a freighter who said she was his niece and then never came back. And 1 was a boy of 15 named Thomas who had arrived alone on a horse that wasn't his, which told its own story, and who had been working the trading post alongside Calhoun for a year and a half and who was, Nora said without any change in her face, probably the hardest worker of the bunch. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, which one was in the cottonwood when I rode in? She said, that would be Eli, he does that. I said, does what? She said, watches from high places. He likes to know what's coming before it arrives. I understood that, more than she probably meant me to. I stayed the night. There was a room off the back that had been Calhoun's, and Nora had kept it more or less in order. A clean blanket, a lamp, a window with actual glass in it that looked out toward the barn. I lay on that bed in my clothes and listened to the house settle around me, and I thought about what I was doing. What I owned as of 4 weeks ago was a working ranch with a good foreman and a crew of 7 men I trusted, 300 miles north. What I had come into, unexpected and unexplained, was this: a trading post on a dry flat, an account that wouldn't last the winter, 14 mules, a barn with a leaking roof, and 11 children who had nowhere else to go. I am not a sentimental man. I don't tell stories about my feelings as a general rule, and I won't start now. What I'll tell you is what I did. I got up at 4:30, before the house was awake, and I walked the property in the dark. I walked the corral and tested the fence posts. I walked the barn and found the 3 places where light came through the roof and marked them in my head. I walked the perimeter and found the well and found the secondary water trough that had gone dry and found a cache of lumber under a tarp behind the barn that was good dry pine, enough for the roof work and more. I walked back through the trading post counting the shelves and what was on them. I went through the books again in the lamplight, column by column. When the sky went pink, I had a number in my head, not a feeling. A number, what it would cost to bring the post current, repair what needed repairing, stock it for winter, run it through a lean season, and see what kind of operation it really was when it had the resources it needed. The number was not small, but I had the money. What I was asking myself, the honest question under all the arithmetic, was whether I was willing to stay. Not to own the place. Owning it was simple. The question was whether I was willing to stand in it and be responsible for it, because a ranch you can run from a distance with a good foreman, but a house with 11 children in it is not that kind of thing. A house with 11 children requires a person to be present, to be the one who decides, to be the one when the night goes wrong who gets up. I don't know how long I stood there in the gray light before the sun came up. Long enough that my coffee went cold. Long enough that the boy Eli appeared at the corner of the barn and sat down on the fence rail 20 feet away and waited, not speaking, just present the way a dog is present, not wanting anything, just keeping you company in the dark. I looked at him, he looked back. I said, how long have you been up? He said, before you. I said, you do that too, walk the property at dark. He thought about it, he said, I used to do it with Mr. Calhoun. There it was, right there. Not a needle, not a manipulation, just a fact, said plain, by a boy who'd lost something and was watching to see if the replacement was worth a damn. I said, what did you check? He listed it: fence, barn, well, the snare line he'd set along the south wall for rabbits, the cottonwood for a loose branch he'd been watching. He recited it the way a man recites it, methodically, in order. I said, you missed the lumber cache. He said, no, I didn't, I just didn't say it. I drank the rest of my cold coffee. I said, you want a job? He looked at me. Something shifted in his face. Not happiness exactly, more like the careful, measuring look of a person who has been offered things before and learned to check the weight of them first. He said, doing what? I said, helping me fix this place up. He said, are you staying? I said, yes. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, all right. That was the hiring of my first hand at the Salado post. 8 years old, 17 pounds wet, and the most serious employee I ever had. Nora fed me breakfast without comment, and I ate it without comment, and then I told her what I intended to do. I said I was staying. I said I was going to bring the post up to what it should be, repairs, full stock, a better arrangement with the freighters who came through, and a working school for the children because they needed one, and Calhoun apparently had intended to build a proper schoolroom but never had. I said I would need her to stay on in her current capacity at a salary that was not an insult, and that I would need her to tell me honestly anything I was getting wrong, because I had run a cattle operation for 22 years, and I knew nothing about trading posts and less than nothing about children. She was looking at the table while I said this. When I finished, she looked up. She said, why are you doing this? I said, because it needs doing. She said, that's not an answer. I said, it's the only answer I've got right now. She held my eyes for a moment, not challenging, not soft, just reading. She was good at reading. I'd figure that out over time. Then she said, all right, but I want the school built before winter. Calhoun kept saying spring, and then it was fall, and then he got sick. I said, I'll start the framing next week. She said, I'll hold you to that. And she did. The first month was the hardest. Not because of the work, I knew work, had known it my whole life, and there was plenty of it here. The roof on the barn took 4 days. Eli was on the ladder beside me for 2 of them, handing nails with a precision that would have shamed some grown men I'd hired. Thomas, the 15-year-old, turned out to be exactly what Nora had said, a worker. A real one, strong and quiet, and with the good instinct of a boy who's had to look after himself. The 2 Apache children, a girl named Saya and her brother Kano, were 11 and 12 respectively, and they were the best trackers I'd ever seen. I found out after the first week that the reason the post's rabbit supply was so consistent was that Saya had been running snares in a pattern along the creek bed that Calhoun apparently taught her, which she had maintained every day without being asked. No, the work wasn't hard. The hard part was the rest of it. The hard part was the noise. Lord, the noise. I had lived alone on the Pratt Fork for years at a stretch, long days and quiet evenings, and a bunkhouse that was 100 yards from the main house. The trading post had 11 children in it, in 8 rooms, and the sound of 11 children getting up in the morning is something that I cannot fully describe to you, except to say it fills every corner of a building like water fills a jug. Not all of it unpleasant. Some of it was funny, even, but constant and close. And for the first 2 weeks I woke every morning with a low tightness in my chest like a man who has opened his door and found the whole world on his porch. The hard part was the twin girls, Lena and Clara, who were 6 and who had taken against me silently and completely from the first morning, and who would not look at me directly for nearly 3 weeks. I don't hold it against them. They'd been left. People who get left have good reasons not to look at new arrivals directly, but it wore on me more than I expected, that particular silence, more than the noise. The hard part was Florida, who was 9 and who had nightmares, and who woke 2 or 3 times a week crying in a way that cut right through the walls, and who would not be comforted by anyone except Nora, who would sit with her until it passed. The first time I heard it, I got up and went to the door of the room the girls shared, not knowing what to do, just standing there in the hall feeling large and useless, and Nora came out and saw me and said quietly, "Go back to sleep, Mr. Pratt." "I have her." She said it without judgment, just as a fact, and went back in, and I went back to my room and lay there listening to the crying settle into quiet, and felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was helpless. I don't like feeling helpless. It has always been the thing I like least. The hard part was realizing that managing this place was not like managing a ranch. On a ranch, the problems are land and weather and cattle and men, and most of those problems respond to force of will and sufficient labor and the occasional expenditure of money. A house with 11 children in it, the problems there are different in kind. They are soft problems. They require a different kind of attention, and I was 50 years behind on learning that. About 6 weeks in, I made a mistake. Calhoun's youngest by blood was a boy named Reed, 7 years old, small and redheaded, and with a temper on him like a cat that's been stepped on. Reed had decided I was the enemy. I don't know when exactly, I think it was there from the first day, and he expressed this opinion in the way 7-year-olds do. which is indirectly, persistently, and with a creativity that is almost impressive. What he did specifically on this particular day was untie my horse while I was working in the trading post, which meant the horse wandered half a mile to the south before Thomas spotted it and brought it back. It was not a crisis. It was an inconvenience, and a deliberate one. I found Reed in the kitchen. I was not gentle about it. I told him straight out that what he'd done was dangerous, not to me, to the horse, and that if he had a problem with me being here he could say so to my face instead of taking it out on an animal that had done nothing to him. He told me, with full accuracy, to go to hell. I will say this for the boy, he said it to my face. He didn't flinch. He stood there, all 45 pounds of him, and said it directly. I looked at him for a moment, and then I sat down on the kitchen floor, because I was too tall to talk to him standing up, and I'd figured that out by then at least. I said, "That's fair. You probably feel like hell is where I should go. I showed up and I'm not your father, and I'm not Calhoun, and I've been here 6 weeks, and I still don't know half your names right." He stared at me. I said, "I know yours, Reed. And I know you like to be left alone when you're angry because you go to the corner of the barn and you sit with your back to the wall and you don't want anyone near you. I know that because I do the same thing." Something moved in his face, not much, a tightening. I said, "I'm not going anywhere. That's the only thing I can tell you that's worth telling. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to pretend that fixes anything, and you can keep being angry at me as long as you need to. But don't take it out on the horse." I got up and walked out. That evening he helped Thomas and me carry planks for the schoolroom framing. He didn't say a word to me. He just worked. I let him. A week later, he started coming to check the fence line with me in the morning. The schoolroom went up in October. I had promised Nora before winter, and it was before winter, just barely. She had drawn out what she wanted. A single room, south-facing windows for light, a proper wood floor, a stove, enough desks for all 11 children with room to grow. I built it with Thomas and Eli, and in the last week, with 2 Pima men from the settlement 4 miles west who heard we were building and came over to help because they had children they wanted to send. Nora walked in the first morning. She stood in the center and turned around once and looked at the windows and the stove and the desks I'd made from pine boards, and she was quiet for a long time. I was about to ask if something was wrong. She said, "He promised this for 3 years." I said, "I know." She turned and looked at me. There was something in her face I hadn't seen before, something that wasn't the careful, reading look she usually wore. It was softer than that, and more tired and more honest, and it hit me harder than I was expecting. She said, "Thank you, Caleb." First time she'd used my name, in 6 weeks. I had been Mr. Pratt for 6 weeks, and she said Caleb like it was a thing she'd been deciding about, and this was the morning she'd decided. I said, "You're welcome, Nora." And I walked out to let her have it. Winter came hard that year. A cold snap in late November that turned the salado to iron and froze the top 2 feet of the well. I'd been expecting it. You get a feel for the sky out there, the particular gray-yellow of a sky that's about to mean business. And I'd put up a good wood supply and a good feed supply, and banked the foundation of the schoolroom and the post itself with straw bales. Even so, the first week of hard cold was an education. The twins, Lena and Clara, had come around by then. I don't know exactly when it happened. There was no single moment, just a slow accumulation of mornings where they were slightly less on guard, until one day Lena asked me to tie her bootlace, and I did. And after that they were different with me. Still quiet, still watchful, but the hostility had gone out of it. Children, I was learning, don't give you their trust in one piece. They give it in fractions over time, and you either earn each fraction or you don't. During the cold snap, Florida got sick. Not desperately sick, a chest cold, a cough, but sick enough that she couldn't sleep and couldn't eat, and was miserable in the specific boneless way a sick child is miserable. Nora sat with her most of that first night and most of the second, and on the third night I told her to sleep, and I sat up with Florida myself. I am not a man who is comfortable with sick children. I want to be honest about that. I sat in the chair beside her bed and I didn't know what to do with my hands. I had a lamp. I had a book I wasn't reading. Florida looked at me from under her blanket with her dark eyes and her color all wrong and said something in Spanish that I didn't catch. I said, "What's that?" She said it again slower. My Spanish is rough, but I got it. She was asking if I was staying. I said, "I'm right here." She said, "No, I mean staying, here." I said, yes, I'm staying here. She considered this for a moment. Then she pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. She was asleep in 10 minutes. I sat there in the lamplight with the cold pressing in through the walls and the rest of the house silent, and I thought about that question, whether I was staying. She'd asked it the way Eli had asked it, the way all of them were still asking it in their own ways, not with hope, because they'd been burned on hope, but with a kind of waiting that was harder than hope. A readiness to be disappointed that they'd lived in so long it had become their default. It is something to be the person who answers that question right. I should tell you about me and Nora, about how that happened, because it didn't happen the way those things usually happen in stories. There was no single evening, no great declaration. What there was this. There were the mornings where we went over the accounts together at the table before the children were up. Just the two of us and the lamplight, and the sound of the wind off the flats, talking numbers in low voices. There were the decisions we made together, one at a time. When to order new stock and how much, which freighter routes to court for winter trade, whether to take on a Navajo weaving business that a trader named Cordell had proposed, which I was for and she was against, and which she turned out to be right about. There were the evenings where the children were settled and the stove had burned down, and we sat on the portal with coffee and didn't always talk, sometimes just sat, which is a thing you can only do with a person you're comfortable with, and that comfort had grown up between us without either of us declaring it. There was the night in December when the temperature dropped to something I had only read about, and a pipe in the back room froze and burst, and I was up at 2 in the morning in the cold trying to get it sorted, and Nora came out in her coat over her nightgown with a lamp and held it steady for 2 hours while I worked. We didn't talk much. She held the lamp exactly where I needed it without being told, and when I finally got the pipe wrapped and the water shut off, she said, "You should warm up before you lose a finger." And we went back inside and she made coffee, and we sat at the table in the quiet, and I looked at her in the lamplight, the exhaustion in her face, the cold reddened hands wrapped around the cup, the set of her mouth, and I thought, this woman is the reason this house is still standing. Not me, her. She had been here before me, and she had held the thing together with not enough money and not enough help and 11 children who needed more than she could give alone, and she had done it because there was no one else. That kind of staying, that is not a small thing. I said, "Nora." She looked up. I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the honest answer." She said, "All right." I said, "Are you happy here?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was before Calhoun got sick. It got hard after." I said, "Is it still hard?" She looked at me. "It's different now." I said, "Better or worse?" She said, "Better," a pause, "a lot better." I said, "That's what I wanted to know." I didn't say more than that, not that night, but something shifted, like a door that had been slightly off its frame settling onto the hinge. January brought the freighters. The winter trade I had been expecting, 2 freighting operations that ran the Rio Salado corridor through the cold months, hauling copper ore south and dry goods back north, came through the post starting in the first week of January, and by the 3rd week I had negotiated agreements with both outfits to use the post as a regular way station. Feed and water for the mules, board for the drivers, resupply at fair prices. It was not complicated. What they needed was a reliable operation, and a reliable operation is what I knew how to build. Thomas ran the stable operations with a competence that still surprises me when I think about it. He was 16 by then, 17 by spring, and he handled teams of mules the way some men twice his age never learned to, with a quiet firmness that the animals read immediately. Kana worked alongside him. The boy barely spoke to any of the freighters, but he could read a mule's temper at 50 yards and had the timing to handle a spooked team before it spooked. Together, they were better than a crew of full-grown men. Nora managed the boarding, the meals, the rooms, the resupply, with an efficiency that the freighters noticed. These were not men who praised easily. They were men on a schedule, men who'd been through bad way stations and good ones and knew the difference immediately. Within a month, I was hearing from the second outfit that the first outfit had recommended us specifically by name. That was Nora's doing. The food was right, the prices were fair, the place was clean, and she remembered every driver's name after one meeting. Those are not small things on a long freight run. The money improved. Not dramatically, it was still a lean operation, but the winter that should have been a loss broke even, and I could see the shape of what the spring and summer would be. I found her in the schoolroom one afternoon in February, after the children's lessons were done. She was at the window, the south window, the good light one, reading something, standing up the way she always read, one hand on the sill, and the light was the flat winter light off the snow on the flats, and it came in clean and white, and she didn't hear me come in. I stood there a moment. I thought about a lot of things in that moment, standing in the door of a room I'd built with my own hands, watching a woman I'd come to respect more than anyone I could name, in a house with 11 children in it who had been lost and weren't lost anymore, on a flat, dry piece of land that was mine by accident and was becoming mine by choice. I said, "Nora." She turned. I said, "I want to ask you something else." She put the book down on the desk. I said, "I don't know how to do this well. I've been a rancher my whole life, and I know how to ask a man if he wants a job, and I know how to negotiate a freighting contract, and I am fairly good at fence work. I don't know how to do this." She looked at me, that reading look. I said, "I'd like you to stay, not as the employed person who runs this house. I'd like you to stay as my wife if that's something you'd consider, and I want to say before you answer that I know what you've done here, and I know it was you who held this together before I got here. And I know that what you'd be getting is an old rancher who doesn't know anything about children and is learning slow. But I would be loyal to you, and I would not leave. And I can tell you this house would have fallen down in 6 weeks without you, and that's the plain truth." She stood very still. Then she walked across the room toward me, and she stopped closer than she'd been before, and she put her hand flat on the center of my chest. Right there. Just rested it there and looked up at me. She said, "You built this room." I said, "Yes." She said, 3 years he promised it, and you built it in 6 weeks. I said before winter. She said, "You did," a pause. "Yes, Caleb, I'll stay." I put my hand over hers. That was all. We stood there in the winter light of the room I'd built, and I felt something come loose in my chest that I hadn't known was wound tight. We were married in April in the trading post, by a circuit preacher named Hayworth who ate 3 plates of dinner and stayed the night and left in the morning with $6, and a good word for the post to everyone he passed. All 11 children were there. Eli sat in the front and watched the whole thing with his flat, serious expression. Reed stood in the back with his arms crossed, which was how Reed stood when he didn't want you to know he was pleased about something. The twins wore matching dresses that Nora had made from a bolt of blue cloth that had been sitting on the shelf since before Calhoun. Florida cried, which she'd explained to me beforehand was what she did at weddings, not from sadness. I hadn't been at many weddings. I hadn't expected to be at my own. After Hayworth was done and had eaten his 3rd plate, and the children had worn themselves to exhaustion on the excitement of it, and the trading post had gone quiet, Nora and I sat on the portal in the April dark. The stars were the clean, cold kind you get after a clear day. The cottonwoods moved in a light wind, and somewhere in the dark Eli's rabbit snares were set along the creek the way they always were, and the barn was quiet, and the whole flat land lay out to the south and the west in the silver dark. I said, "You all right?" She said, "Very." She was leaning against my shoulder. Not performing it, just leaning, the way a person leans against something solid because it's there and it holds. I didn't say anything more. Here's what I know about children. I know this now 8 years on, which I didn't know at 43. Children are not complicated in the way you think they are. They are complicated in the way weather is complicated, not because the underlying thing is mysterious, but because there are a lot of layers and they don't always tell you what's happening inside them. But what they need at the bottom is simple. They need someone who shows up. They need someone who does the same thing tomorrow that they did today. They need someone who, when it is 3 in the morning and it has gone wrong, gets up. That's the whole job. Everything else is just the particular shape of it. Thomas is 25 now. He runs a freighting operation out of Mesa with 3 wagons and a crew of 4, and he named his company Salado Freight, which I won't pretend doesn't mean something to me. He came back 3 Christmases ago with a wife, a woman from Sonora, small and serious and with a laugh that fills a room, and we put them in Calhoun's old room and stayed up late around the stove, and I watched Thomas's wife look at Thomas the way Nora looks at me when she thinks I'm not watching, which is with a particular, quiet, private satisfaction, the look of a woman who has taken the full measure of a man and found it sufficient. Eli is 22. He is working for the surveying office in Tucson and has been writing to me in his careful, methodical way about a piece of land he has his eye on to the northeast, where the grass stays green longer. He wants to know what I think. I told him I'll come look at it with him in the fall. He wrote back, all right. 2 words on a postcard, which is Eli's version of enthusiastic. Kano and Saya went back to their mother's people when Kano was 17. A choice I supported and Nora supported, and which was right for them, and which I will not sentimentalize except to say that they come back every summer for a week, and Saya's children play in the same cottonwood where Eli used to sit. Reed runs the trading post with me. He's 21 and he has his mother's coloring, red-headed, freckled, and with Calhoun's blue eyes, and he still crosses his arms when he's pleased about something. He has grown into a serious, capable, fair-minded young man who will argue with me on a business decision without raising his voice, and who is almost always right when he does. He asked me last fall if I wanted to make him a formal partner in the business. I said I'd been treating him like one for 3 years already. He said he wanted it in writing. I said that was fair. We got it in writing. The twins, Lena and Clara, are 14 and are a terror in the schoolroom in the best possible way. They have surpassed everything Nora knew to teach them, and are both being sent to a proper school in Tucson this fall on a scholarship arranged by a teacher there who heard about them from Hayworth, who still comes through twice a year. I expect they will go somewhere. I plan to watch it happen. Florida is 16 and she does not have nightmares anymore. She has a horse and she works the garden with a precision that would shame a professional farmer. She still cries at weddings. The others are scattered in the good way people scatter, working, living, writing letters, coming back at Christmas with more people than you plan to feed. Here is the thing I want to say before I'm done. I came to the Salado post at 43 years old, a man who had spent 22 years building one thing and knew how to run it. I knew land and cattle and the math of a working operation, and I knew my own self fairly well, which is to say I knew I was capable, and I knew I was alone, and I knew the aloneness had stopped bothering me the way it used to, which is either a man making peace with his life or a man who has stopped noticing what he's missing. I don't know which it was. What I know is this. The morning I rode out to look at a property I was planning to sell, a flat, dry trading post on the Rio Salado, 2-story adobe, a leaky barn, 14 mules, an account that wouldn't cover winter. I came around a bend in the road, and a child was sitting in a cottonwood tree watching me with the particular, steady attention of someone who had learned to check things before they arrived. And a woman came through from the back of a room and set a pan on the stove and looked at me like weather coming in with attention, without alarm. And 11 children were living in a house that needed one more person in it who would not leave. I know what I came into, what I walked into more precisely, because walking in was what I chose to do, and choosing is the part I want you to understand. No one asked me to stay. The deed was mine regardless. The money was mine regardless. I could have sold the post, set a trust for the children, been generous about it, and gone back to the Pratt Fork and carried on with my deliberate, clean life and never known what I was missing. I know what I would have missed. I would have missed Eli in the cottonwood at first light, watching the land. I would have missed Reed's arm-crossed, secret pleasure at a thing that has gone right. I would have missed Florida asleep in 10 minutes because someone told her they were staying. I would have missed Thomas's wife looking at Thomas the way Nora looks at me. And I would have missed Nora. In the schoolroom in the winter light, her hand flat on my chest. Yes, Caleb, I'll stay. There are men who have more than I have. Bigger ranches, more money, more of a lot of things. I have a trading post on the Salado Flats and a good woman who chose to stay, and 11 people who were lost and aren't anymore. And the whole of that belongs to me in a way that the Pratt Fork, for all its 4,000 head, never quite did. That will do. That will more than do.